We can look at history, including the current moment, through the lens of the trickster. The trickster is an archetype, a living psychic entity that unfolds in the collective unconscious through a dynamic organic process. We're going to trace the archetype through stages of unfolding from the spontaneous and widespread social type of the shaman through its ritualization, specifically in the rites of Dionysus and the dramatic tradition that followed from it, to its coming to animate revolutionary political movements dissociated from its symbolic origins in the living psyche. Finally, we'll take stock and consider where we can go from here as we try to integrate ruling reason with subversive folly. In his essay on the psychology of the trickster figure, Jung describes the trickster as a fundamental psychological pattern, relating it to our lower, unconscious animal nature. The trickster's ridiculous antics involve paradox, both degraded and holy. It is expressed in festivals of social inversion, carnivals, bacchanalia, and saturnalia marked by riotous disinhibition and rule by the lowly. The shaman is a widespread social type who embodies the trickster archetype. The trickster may be sexually ambiguous or androgynous, such as seen in the phenomenon of the shaman's spirit spouse. Mircea Eliade argues that the shaman shows something of madness with a critical difference. He has healed himself, allowing him to control his entry into disrupted mental states through techniques of ecstasy involving chanting, fasting, or sleep deprivation. In these trance-like states, the shaman shows enhanced connection to the living world of nature and amplified intuition. As such, the shaman plays an adaptive role in their community, guiding others towards insight and healing. Dionysus is one important representative of the trickster archetype from ancient Greek mythology and echoes the attributes of the shaman. He is closely associated with living nature in animal and vegetable form, especially the riotous growth of vines and their grapes. Wine and the intoxication it brings is associated with Dionysian frenzy, a sort of fever that produces both madness and healing. Women especially are linked with his cult, and in their frenzy his female followers were said to tear animals to pieces. Death and dismemberment, but also rebirth, are associated with him, including the yearly renewal of fertile vegetation and his own death and rebirth. Dionysus was a major god, and the Western tradition of theater originates in his rites. Both tragedy and comedy were originally offered in honor to the god, and through dramatic tradition we can trace Dionysian themes in history to the present. 3 plays, Sophocles Antigone, Euripides Bacchae, and Shakespeare's King Lear, show the core narrative. Each play begins with a king laying out his resolved course of action, entirely rational in his narrow framing, but unwise to anyone who can see a broader perspective. Thus, one king decrees a traitor be left to rot. Another forbids the implantation of Dionysian worship in his city. And another resolves to divide his kingdom between his daughters on condition they flatter him with professions of love. Each king arrogantly sweeps aside the objections offered by a feminine character. Creon's niece Antigone is determined to bury her brother. Lear's daughter Cordelia will not degrade her father by falsely proclaiming him as her only love. Or in the case of King Pentheus in the Bacchae, the androgynous priest demanding recognition of Dionysus is actually the god himself in disguise. In all cases, the king's rashness is punished by disaster to himself and to the state. Each of the 3 kings is humiliated, his masculine pride destroyed through feminization, hysteria for Creon and Lear, Pentheus paraded dressed as a woman, and his mind shaken to madness. Lear is reduced to the state of an animal pelted by stormy nature, while Pentheus is taken for a beast and dismembered by his own mother and the other crazed Bacchae. The role of madness becomes more distinct through the dramatic tradition, eventually being personified in the fool who accompanies Lear. In all 3, the king's ordeal brings a kind of healing, the recovery of wisdom conveyed to the audience through the suffering of the king. In holding to a narrow and self-centered vision, the king has shown hubris, which must be punished and corrected. The plays ultimately share a common meaning. Wisdom involves awe, the respect of the cosmic order which surpasses any finite frame. In modernity, the archetypal symbols are increasingly forgotten, as the rejection of traditional culture strips its forms of vitality and relevance. According to Jung, the archetypes retain much of their instinctive power, but as our cultural literacy fades, the activity of the archetypes within us becomes increasingly obscure. Ultimately, like anything rejected and repressed into the unconscious shadow, they become dysregulated and compulsive. Unable to recognize the symbolic forms within us, we project them out onto the world and misperceive them as external reality. Rituals of Bacchanalia have long been suppressed, and we no longer recognize the trickster and his healing madness with wary reverence. It stands to reason that these patterns would reappear in history, and that we fail to understand their course and meaning. What was understood in mythic experience is now framed in ideological narrative. Politics comes to unconsciously express the archetypal forces of king and folly, reason and power, and insurgent rebellion, but cannot bring them into balance. In the French Revolution, the old pattern of Bacchanalia is transformed, becoming more radical and less self-aware. The Enlightenment had upheld the ideal of reason uncontaminated by the foolishness of magical and symbolic thinking. In this light, monarchy is a mere superstition to be discarded on the march to progress. Rather than invoking a healing corrective to the hubris of the king, the revolution seeks to end monarchy once and for all and replace it with the permanent rule of reason. In the end, the revolution is imbued with a familiar frenzy, and its self-destructive course foreshadows the trajectory of modernity towards crisis. As Burke foresaw, the overthrow of the king does not end the rule of power, but indicates its intensification. The Poissardes, women of the fish market, stormed Versailles, baying for the head and limbs of the queen. One said, "Give me an arm, I want a leg," said another. And failing that, tore her bed to shreds. With the royal family captive, the revolutionary mob triumphantly paraded back to Paris, brandishing the heads of royal guards on pikes painted with makeup. These scenes of dismemberment and feminized humiliation directly echo Euripides Bacchae. The elevation of reason into a religion where man worships his own greatness is a sort of madness and occasions the fall of Robespierre. But the rationalized framework which produced the revolution is incompatible with wonder and obstructs the attainment of wisdom. The French Revolution was followed by others in a cycle. The Romantics criticized reason itself as tyrannical, excluding the passions, the inspired, the mad, and prophetic. They sought the elevation of the irrational rather than a renewed balance between ruling power and subversive folly. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud recognized the central importance of the libido, but argued that it must be subjugated to the rational ego, and that under civilization it would always be more frustrated than satisfied. The post-war social order in America was built on these Freudian lines, seeking to maximize but also contain libidinal satisfaction within a rational institutional framework. This is the world that Betty Friedan describes in The Feminine Mystique. State, media, and corporations systematically stimulating, satisfying, and supervising the libidinal fulfillment of the citizenry, stripped of agency and objectified as population. For a new generation of radicals, the routine satisfaction of libidinal appetites was seen as too routine, too mechanical, ultimately lifeless. Marcuse criticized the regime of what he called repressive desublimation, where society does not repress the libido but disarms it of its subversive and revolutionary potential through routine and commercialized satisfaction. The supremacy of reason must be broken to make room for eros. More broadly, left Freudians such as Reich and Marcuse denied Freud's pessimistic conclusion that civilization necessarily required repression and neurosis. The left Freudians claimed that the necessity of repression was historically contingent rather than being rooted in human nature. A sexual revolution would change the cultural conditions which produced repression, and a new generation of liberated men and women would arise free of the hang-ups of those who went before. Ultimately, it was only mental chains that kept us enslaved. This account of politics proved irresistible to many, and a massive culture war ensued between establishment squares and counterculture subversives. Like the French Revolution, the sexual revolution featured Dionysian scenes. Unlike the French revolutionaries, the 60s counterculture radicals were somewhat self-aware in this regard. They intentionally tried to cultivate shamanic and cosmic consciousness. The merry pranksters wanted to blow the minds of the entire nation, and the yippies tried to levitate the Pentagon and cleanse it of evil spirits. Even relatively buttoned-down Hillary Rodham, not yet married to Bill Clinton, said in her 1969 Wellesley commencement speech, "We're searching for more immediate, ecstatic, and penetrating modes of living." And yet the shamanism of the 1960s largely remained a one-sided caricature. Caught in the narrow logic of revolution, it could not conceive of a renewed wholeness integrating reason and foolishness, but merely sought to invert the existing relationship. Despite inroads in the culture war, square institutions of power merely took on groovy garb, selling counterculture as commodity. It's not just that hippies became yuppies. More fundamentally, postmodern thinkers such as Foucault see the whole Left Freudian project of Reich and Marcuse as reinstating domination at the most fundamental level, that of the grammar of our thought. He sees this in any such meta-narrative as imbued with the will to knowledge, and sees it as yet another form of, I quote, "the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us." Foucault stakes out a position that would seem to be maximally resistant to morphing into yet another structure of oppression, a commitment to a multiplicity of tactics and a proliferation of discourses, to disdain the ideal of truth itself in favor of a shifting ambiguity and valorization of marginality. As such, it upholds not reason or eros as the ruling element, but seeks to end the reign of any ruling logic, siding with continual contestation, #resistance as an end in itself. And yet, even at this maximalist position, it proved necessary to enlist a concrete social structure. At the end of his life, Foucault put some hopes in neoliberalism as a vehicle for his hoped-for reign of diversity, which would allow the flourishing of the marginal, the excluded, the divergent, the creative, and the individual. The contemporary political prominence of sexual minorities echoes the androgyny of the shaman. Following Nietzsche, Foucault knew that any liberatory overturning of the social order would ossify into an oppressive institutional order itself. He must have foreseen what we now experience, that neoliberalism would one day develop into a concrete social structure itself, which ratified injustice and served the interests of its own ruling class. When the state, military, media, academic, technological, and even financial structures of our day uphold neoliberalism in the name of diversity, we have to recognize a new establishment with vast powers of surveillance and control. In the age of surveillance capitalism, Zuboff distinguishes what she calls neoliberal instrumentarian power from totalitarianism in its employment of strategies of behavioral modification rather than violence. But the two ideologies are similar in the totalizing scope of their ambitions. Once again, what is conceived as a total revolution dedicated to the destruction of centralized power ends up instead producing an intensified variant of the old structure. I argue that the problem here is the overarching analysis of anarchic resistance in opposition to reason and power. When the archetype of the trickster is reduced to this propositional account, it is shorn of far too much of its vitality. As described by Jung, the trickster is a body and soul practicing presence in nature, openness to intuition, cognitive flexibility, and self-transformation. Participation in this symbol involves inhabiting our animal nature and facing the darkness within our personality and that which we share with other members of our species. The androgyny of the shaman is not a dogmatic propositional stance in opposition to a perceived oppressive gender binary, but the bringing together of yin and yang, the fundamental aspects of the cosmos. Like all archetypes, including that of the father or king, the trickster is a living pattern, generative and open-ended. The polarity between these two patterns is real, but this is a complementarity which does not allow for one element to attain final victory and the other to be overcome. Following Vervaeke, we can draw parallels between the two patterns to opponent processing in the ongoing evolutionary fittedness of living beings to their environment. By remaining in a given framework, one can exploit opportunities, but this needs to be balanced against exploration, which may yield other and better frames. According to Vervaeke, one sees similar psychotechnologies of balance in wisdom traditions such as Buddhism, Stoicism, and Neoplatonism. Meditation can free one's mind from too narrow habits of thought, while in contemplation one deepens one's engagement with the containing world. Both are necessary, as well as the skill to move from one to the other and the discernment of when and how to do so. Modernity falsely taught us to banish metaphor and meaning and to deny the sacred. But now, as always, wisdom recognizes awe as the inexhaustible wellspring of life.